Chapter 8. Tracy was nursing the baby a few weeks later while Maddie peeled potatoes for stew. Tracy was thrilled she'd worked so hard to teach the younger girl the fundamentals of cooking, because it had made her own life so much easier since the baby was born. She was stunned by the amount of time a new baby took. She'd seen it all happening at the orphanage, but she had only had to do it for an hour or two at a stretch. Having a child she was responsible for around the clock was so much different. Edith was as sweet as could be most of the time, but when she was hungry, she became very demanding. Tracy stroked her little cheek as it pumped in and out sucking milk. Tracy jumped at the sound of hoof prints in the yard. It wasn't time for the men to be home for several hours. "Who is that, Maddie?" Maddie went to the window and peered out. "It's George's son again." "Amos. How odd." Tracy shrugged. "Go see what he needs." She pulled the blanket she had the baby covered with up over her breast to conceal what she was doing as best she could. She didn't want to expose herself to all of Texas. Maddie came back into the house and shrugged. He said he could only talk to Andy. The only other time since they'd been married that George's son had ridden out there was the day the private detective had come to town. Tracy sincerely hoped something like that wasn't happening again. She was happy with her life, and she didn't need anyone to come along and mess things up. Who else would come though? They'd made it clear to her mother that she was no longer welcome. Surely she wouldn't come back. Less than 15 minutes later, just after Tracy laid Edith down for her nap, they heard the sounds of horses again. "It's busy here today," Tracy mumbled as she went to the door. Liking guests as much as the next woman, she opened the door to greet whoever was there. She stopped and stared. Her mother was in a buggy with a wealthy-looking gentleman. The man got down and helped Cecilia down, and the two of them walked toward the house. Tracy shut her bedroom door where Edith slept, before going back to the door to inquire why they were there. Cecilia smiled and ran to Tracy as if they hadn't parted on bad terms. "Tracy, I've missed you." She grabbed Tracy in a bear hug. Tracy pulled back. "You don't even know me." Cecilia sighed heavily. "I want you to meet your stepdaddy. Bert, this is my daughter that I've told you so much about." Tracy looked at her mother wondering what she possibly could have said about her. She barely knew anything about her. She hadn't bothered to ask any questions or even to listen when Tracy offered details about her life. Maddie put the potatoes she'd chopped up into the stew pot before walking over to stand beside Tracy. "Why are you here?" she asked rudely. Cecilia sighed. "You haven't taught this child any manners yet? She has perfect manners around people who deserve her respect." "What can I do for you?" Cecilia pouted dramatically. "I've missed my little girl." "Yes, you did. You missed her entire childhood. What do you want?" Tracy knew her words were blunt and rude, but she couldn't seem to force herself to be nice to the woman in front of her. Why was she there? "I wanted to come see how you were doing." Cecilia's eyes dropped to Tracy's waist. "So you had the baby?" Tracy didn't want to answer that, but Edith was her mother's granddaughter. She may have been a terrible mother, but did that give Tracy the right to keep her granddaughter from her? "Yes." Cecilia's eyes widened and a smile spread across her face. "Did you have a boy or girl?" "A girl." She added nothing, not even the baby's name. She didn't know why her mother was there, but she didn't have a good feeling about it. "Oh, a girl. I'd like to see her," Cecilia insisted. "Where is she?" She looked around the room for the baby. Tracy bit her lip for a moment before walking to her bedroom door and opening it. "Keep your voices down. She's sleeping." She didn't feel like it was the right thing to do to keep her mother from the baby, but she didn't want her to touch her either. Cecilia looked at the baby with tears in her eyes, leaning down to pick up her granddaughter. "She looks just like you did as an infant." She clucked to the baby, holding her awkwardly. It was all Tracy could do not to jump forward and snatch the baby from the older woman's hands. "What's her name?" "Edith." Tracy stepped forward and gently took the baby from her mother's arms. If it had been anyone else there with her, she would have talked endlessly about what a good baby she was, but her mother deserved no information at all. Tracy moved back into the kitchen and sat down in her rocking chair, soothing the baby who'd woken up the moment Cecilia plucked her from her cradle. She wished with all her heart that Andy was there. He'd know what to do. Bert walked over to stand in front of Tracy. He pulled his wallet from the pocket of his slacks and opened it. "How much do you want?" Tracy looked back and forth between the couple trying to figure out what he was talking about. "What do you mean? Why were they offering her money?" "For the baby. Cecilia said you wouldn't just let us have her." "So how much?" Tracy stared at the man in disbelief. "You think I'm going to sell you my baby?" Her voice was shrill as she held the baby to her. "You can't have my daughter." "Why do you even want her?" Cecilia asked. "Babies are a lot of work. I'll have servants to take care of her, but what do you have?" She seemed to think that the argument would work on Tracy. Further proof that she didn't know Tracy at all. "I have a family who cares about me and a lot of love to give. No matter how much work she is, I'm not giving her up." "They care about you? Has your husband even told you he loves you? You were a mail-order bride." "Men don't fall in love with mail-order brides." Cecilia smirked when she saw the sad look that crossed over Tracy's face. "This is my baby, and you can't have her," Tracy said adamantly. She didn't care if she would have to live under a bridge and live off berries she picked. She wasn't giving up her baby. "Holding out for as much as you can get?" "I don't blame you." Bert flipped through the bills there and took a wad out, offering them to Tracy. "There. 500 ought to do it." She shook her head, still not believing anyone would try to buy a baby. "Not enough?" He counted out a little more. "750 then?" "It's a ridiculous sum, but I like the idea of the baby being related to my wife." Bert made it very clear he was willing to go as high as necessary to buy his wife's granddaughter. The door crashed open and Tracy looked up. She'd never been so thankful to see Andy in all her life. He'd taken the time to stop off at the barn and grab his rifle, which he had cocked at his shoulder. "Get out of my house." Bert turned and looked at Andy. "Cecilia told me Tracy had married a crude outdoorsman." He shook his head as if the other man were beneath him. "Look, I'm offering a good sum of money for that baby." Tracy said no to 500, so how about 750? Andy stared at him in shock. "You're offering to pay me $750 for my baby? You've got to be kidding me." Bert sighed. "Not enough? I only have 1,000 with me, but I can always go to a bank and get more." "We need a baby." Andy shook his head. "I don't care if you need a baby, you're not getting mine. Go to an orphanage. There's one in almost every town. Take your pick of the children there. You're not getting my baby. Now get out." Bert took a step toward Andy. "Now, don't be too hasty. My wife has her heart set on raising her grandbaby, and I can see why. She's a little beauty. I can get as much as you want. There's no need to get hostile." Andy took a deep breath, trying to control his temper. "You cannot have my child for any sum of money on earth. She is mine. Her mother is mine. Get out of my house." He advanced on the older man, gun raised, and prodded him toward the door with the barrel of his rifle. "Don't come back." He slammed the door behind the two of them and stood with his rifle at the ready, watching out the window until he saw them drive off. He rushed over to Tracy, taking her hand and pulling her to her feet and into his arms with the baby between them. Holding his rifle barrel down, he clutched her to him. "They didn't hurt you? Or the baby?" Tracy shook her head, still in utter shock over what had just happened. "They traveled all this way to buy my baby." She was embarrassed to admit she was related to the woman. Andy sighed, stroking her back. He realized he was crushing Edith when she started squalling, and took a step back. "I'm sorry." He set down his rifle and took the baby from Tracy, needing to feel her wiggling in his arms. "I wish we could give you a better grandmother." Tracy sat down and only then began to cry. How could anyone think it was all right to purchase a child? Maddie ran to Tracy and threw her arms around her. "I'm so glad that crazy lady left you at the orphanage." Tracy chuckled a bit through the tears. "Trust Maddie to say just the right thing to make her feel better. I think she may have done me a huge favor." Andy sat down, still cradling the baby in his arms, and Tracy looked at him around the girl in her lap. "How did you know?" "Know what?" he asked. "That they were here? You came in from the range and immediately knew that I needed you. You never come in at this time of day." He sighed. "The best thing about small towns is everyone looks out for each other. George noticed your mother get off a train with a man, so he went and pulled his kid out of school to ride out here and warn me that they were in town. He had a head start, so I had some time to ride toward the house before he told me." He kissed the baby's forehead. "You need to bake those two a huge cake or something." Tracy nodded. "I'll do that." Maddie pulled away and looked at Tracy with a smile. "I'll help." Andy had settled the baby down and gotten her back to sleep. Tracy watched as he took her into the bedroom and laid her in her cradle. She didn't need to eat, did she? It had just occurred to him that maybe the baby wasn't supposed to be sleeping just then. Tracy shook her head. Cecilia woke her when she picked her up. Andy shuddered. "I hate that she even touched the baby." Tracy stood and walked back into his arms. "Thank you for riding so hard to get rid of them." She sighed. "You don't think she'll try anything else, do you?" "No, I don't. I'll send Francis for the sheriff when he gets home, though. I want him to have fair warning in advance there may be trouble." He shook his head. Why were they so fixated on Edith? There are plenty of unwanted children all over. They could go to the orphanage in Beckham and get one if they wanted one so badly. They wanted Edith because she's related to my mother. Tracy looked into his eyes. "I really can't see why that matters. I think you're either a person who will accept any child that comes your way, or you're a person who will reject them all." "That's probably true. I'm glad I married a woman who is willing to raise more than her share of children." Tracy looked at Maddie, who was quietly peeling carrots for the stew. "I couldn't imagine being any other way." Asterisk. Their evening was busy as they explained exactly what had happened to the sheriff and he took notes on the situation. "I'll need descriptions of the couple." Tracy smiled. "The woman looks identical to me, but she's 17 years older." "The man?" He had dark hair and brown eyes. He looked as if he never dressed in anything but a business suit. "Should make them easy to spot around here." The sheriff finished taking notes. "I'll run into town and see if anyone's seen them. Have a talk with them if they're still around." Andy stepped forward and shook the other man's hand. "Thank you, Sheriff." The sheriff looked down at Tracy. "Don't open the door to them again. I hope I can just run them off, and I'll make sure we add extra patrols through here, but just in case, don't open the door." Tracy nodded. "I won't." "Thank you." Over supper, Tracy was quiet. She just lived through a nightmare, and she wasn't sure how to handle it. After the dishes were done that evening, she stepped into her room to be alone, needing time away from the others with just her baby. As she sat on her bed and nursed, she shook her head, still having a hard time believing anyone could think they could just buy a child. She stroked Edith's cheek, and the baby looked up at her, her wide blue eyes staring. "I'll never leave you with anyone. You know that? I love you, Edith. I'm your mama, and that makes you my responsibility. I would never let anyone take you home with them." Andy found them sitting together a few minutes later. The baby was sleeping in Tracy's arms, and she held her staring down into the little face she loved so much. Andy took the baby from Tracy's arms and gently placed her into her cradle. "Are you doing any better?" he asked. He sat down on the bed beside her and gently stroked her arm. Tracy shrugged, the words her mother had taunted her with coming to mind. "I think so." "What is it? Is something else bothering you?" Tracy bit her lip, wondering what to say. How did she tell her husband that she needed him to love her, so he'd better start? Cecilia just said some ugly things. Andy's face grew angry all over again. He put his back to the headboard and slid an arm around her shoulders. "She did? Like what?" He kissed the top of her head where it rested against his shoulder. "She said that, because I was a mail-order bride, you would never be able to love me." There, she'd said it. She didn't really want to hear his response, because she was certain he'd reject her, but at least she'd know. Andy laughed. "Well, that's silly. I hope you told her that I loved you almost from the first moment I saw you." "I couldn't lie to her." She shrugged, a tear slipping out of her eye. Andy looked at her in surprise. "Lie? You think telling her that I love you would be a lie?" He used his thumb to brush the tear from her face. "I've been in love with you for so long, it feels like it's always been the case. You make me happy to get up in the mornings, and even happier to come to bed at night. I was failing miserably at raising my brothers and sister, and you came along and made it look so easy." Tracy blinked a few times, the tears falling down her cheeks. "You really love me?" Andy nodded, his lips gently brushing against hers. "How could anyone not love you? You're an amazing woman." Tracy took a shuddering breath. "I've waited my whole life for anyone to say those words to me." "Oh, Maddie says them, but she's 8. What kid doesn't love the person who takes care of them when they're 8? Well, I love you. I love you so much that the idea of you going away makes me feel like I'm dying inside." "Why would I go away?" Tracy shook her head in disbelief. "You were offered a life of luxury for you and our baby. How could you stay here and not jump on that chance? Who would stay in an old house that looks like it's about to fall over when they could live in a mansion in Boston? You were really worried I'd leave you? For them?" Tracy shook her head. "I love you, Andy. I love you and the children. I don't even want to think about what my life was before you." She sighed, resting her head on his shoulder. "Francis did a good thing for us, sending that letter." She laughed. "I wanted to throttle him for the first couple of days I was here, though." He laughed. "It took me about 24 hours to realize that I could never let you go. You kept talking about how you were only staying for a month and then you were going to go back to Massachusetts. You had it all planned out." He shook his head. "I was so scared I'd come home one day, and you'd be gone. I would have taken Maddie with me. After 10 minutes with you, she'd have followed you anywhere. It's so strange to me that you could have gone through your life without people smothering you with love. I have never in my life met a woman who I thought was good enough to raise my siblings." He sighed. "I didn't want to fall in love with you, you know." "You didn't? Why not?" "My father loved my mother with everything inside him. Seriously, he all but worshipped at her feet. If there was $20 to feed the whole family for a year, he'd spend half of it on a special gift for her, and make us deal with the rest of it. He shook his head. I promised myself long before they died that I would never love a woman the way he loved her. But you wouldn't do that. You don't put me before the children. He laughed softly. Of course I do. I love Edith more than I can ever say, but when I rode toward the house, I was worried about you, not the baby. He stroked her cheek. I love you, but I was afraid to say it. Afraid it would give you too much power over me, but you know what? She shook her head. What? You won't do anything to abuse the power over me. Ever. Why would I do that? I want us all to be happy. I couldn't be happy controlling you that way. She kissed him softly. I love you way too much for that. So you're never going to decide your mother's offer is something you want to accept? You won't take Maddie and Edith and run off to Boston? She shook her head. I would never do that. I feel loved here. I can't go to Boston. No one there feels about me the way you do. He smiled, his eyes dancing happily. I guess I'm glad your mother and her husband came by today acting as they did. You are? Why? Because it forced me to tell you how much I love you, and I like the smile love puts on your beautiful face. Tracy sighed contentedly. I need to go and tuck Maddie in. Before you came, no one ever tucked Maddie in. You spoil her. Tracy got out of bed. Everyone needs to be spoiled sometimes. Epilogue. Francis stood looking out over his 10 acres of land. They were all his now. He'd been working to save enough money to buy them for 10 years. Andy had promised him he'd give him a bull and 6 cows from his own herd to get the ranch started, but first, he had to build a house on it. It was only a mile from his brother's house, and he would be able to visit often, which was one of the reasons he'd been drawn to the land. He looked at the ground where he'd marked out where he wanted his house to go. Tracy had helped him come up with a good plan for it, telling him what she thought should be in a modern kitchen. In 1896, different things were expected than in 1886, when she'd first come to Texas. He looked behind him at the children running and playing. Arthur had since moved to town and was working for George, delivering ice of all things. Who wanted ice delivered? Maddie sat with her legs curled under her on a blanket with Tracy. Sweet little Maddie was 17 now, and she had her eye on a boy from town. Edith was 9, Joseph was 7, Samuel was 5, and Jacob was 3. Tracy was once again huge with her pregnancy, but she and Maddie had declared that Francis finally buying the land he wanted was cause for celebration. He was sure that Tracy was just glad that he was going to be moving out of her house. She needed the space for her rapidly expanding brood. He looked around him and sighed. Once his house was built, almost all of his dreams would come true. The only thing left was to find a wife. A beautiful wife from the East. He was going to follow in his brother's footsteps and send off for a mail-order bride. Yes, he knew that he was the one who'd actually send off for the bride, but that didn't matter. Everyone had conveniently forgotten that little fact. He could send off for a wife for himself more easily anyway. He walked back to the quilt where Tracy and Andy sat with Maddie, eating the last of the food in the picnic basket. He eyed the last tiny pie the two women had made together. Tracy? Are you going to need that pie? I haven't gotten one yet. He knew none of the others would fight him over it, but Tracy was about to pop, and they all knew what that meant. If they valued their lives, they stayed away from the sweets. Tracy looked at the pie in the picnic basket and then at Francis. She really wanted it. Well, it's your picnic, so I'll share it with you. She didn't mention that she'd already had 3 of the tiny pies, and neither did anyone else. They just smiled at her when she cut it in half and offered Francis the bigger piece. Francis sank down onto the quilt and smiled, leaning back on his arms. This is the life. Sitting on my own ranch, in the spring, having a piece of pie. Tracy laughed. It's time for you to start thinking about marrying, don't you think? You're 26 now. She expected him to react the way he always did, telling her he wasn't ready yet. Francis nodded, surprising them all. As soon as the house is built, I'm going to see if I can find myself a mail-order bride. Tracy exchanged looks of surprise with Andy. A mail-order bride? You still write that woman who matched you with Andy, right? What was her name? Elizabeth Miller, wasn't it? Tracy nodded slowly, not sure where this had come from. She's married now, but she still has her business. I'll give you her address when you're ready. Great. He took another bite of his pie, acting as if he didn't realize his announcement of his intention to marry hadn't shocked them all. Maddie looked at Francis. You sure you're ready to marry? I mean, being tied down to just one woman. Are you suggesting I ask Elizabeth for 2 wives? Maddie giggled. Nothing like that. I just thought you were a lone wolf. You always said you wouldn't marry till you were good and ready. That's true. I'm good and ready. He stood up and stretched. This is a fine piece of land. Perfect for my cattle. Andy grinned. What cattle? You don't have any. I will as soon as you give me the ones you promised me. Yes, sir, it's going to be a mighty fine life. Asterisk. 2 months later, Francis sat down at the table in his new house and put pen to paper. Dear Elizabeth, 10 years ago, you matched my brother up with his bride. I want you to do the same for me. I just built my first house on land that I purchased. I'm a rancher, although not a rich one, yet. I'd like to marry a woman between the ages of 18 and 22. I have blonde hair and blue eyes, but I don't care what she looks like. If you could find me an orphan, I'd appreciate that. My brother married Tracy Beckham, an orphan from right there in Beckham where you are. If you could find me a wife just like Tracy, I'd be much obliged. She needs to be able to cook, clean, and love. The ability to love is probably the most important thing to me. Thank you in advance for your help. I live in Nowhere, Texas. Sincerely, Francis Harvey. He set the letter aside to mail the next time he went to Nowhere. George's son had taken over for him around the same time Arthur had started doing the ice deliveries there. Arthur, if he saw the letter, would laugh hysterically at the idea of Francis sending off for his own bride. Arthur had always been a little strange, though. Francis ate a bite of the huge pie Tracy had sent over. He just dug the fork right into the center and started eating. There was no need to use a plate when he'd just have to wash it. Getting into this habit would save his wife a lot of time. He smiled as he thought about his future wife. Yes, someone like Tracy was all he wanted. Life would be good when she was by his side.